Hey guys, tonight we journey back to the muddy streets, smoky kitchens, crowded taverns, and suspicious bath barrels of Colonial America. A place where many people believed that bathing too often could weaken your body, invite deadly sickness, or even slowly kill you without warning. Tonight, you will follow the life of a young Cooper's son named Elias Turner, who grew up in a small colonial settlement where the smell of sweat, smoke, wet wool, horse manure, and rotting river mud clung to nearly everything and everyone. And if you manage to stay awake through tonight's long, uncomfortable journey into the strange world of colonial hygiene, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me what historical nightmare you'd like to fall asleep to next. The winter wind moved slowly through the narrow wooden streets of the settlement, carrying the scent of burnt firewood and damp animal fur into every alley. Small lanterns flickered outside crooked houses, while thin trails of smoke rose lazily from chimneys into the dark evening sky. Elias Turner sat beside his father inside their cramped workshop, shaving rough pieces of oak into curved planks for water barrels. The room smelled strongly of sawdust, sweat, and vinegar. His father preferred vinegar for cleaning almost everything, because most people in town trusted vinegar far more than water. "Don't touch the river after sunset," his father muttered, while hammering iron hoops around a barrel. "Cold water steals strength from the bones." Elias nodded automatically. He had heard warnings about water his entire life. The river carried disease. Rainwater spoiled quickly. Bathing opened the pores. Open pores allowed invisible sickness to crawl inside the body. At least that was what most adults claimed. Outside the workshop, a cart rolled through thick mud, while pigs wandered freely between homes, searching for scraps. A woman emptied dirty wash water directly into the street without warning. Two men nearby barely reacted when the foul liquid splashed around their boots. Such things happened every day. The settlement itself rested beside a slow-moving river surrounded by dense forest. It was not a large place, but it grew more crowded every season as new families arrived from overseas hopping to escape hunger, debt, or religious persecution. Most homes were packed tightly together, allowing little fresh air between them. During summer, the smell became unbearable, especially near the tannery, where animal hides soaked in urine and chemicals for weeks. But the people who lived there worried less about smell than survival. Bathing simply did not seem important compared to avoiding starvation or freezing during winter. Inside the Turner household, cleanliness followed unusual rules. Elias' mother scrubbed clothing regularly because stained clothes reflected poorly on a family's reputation. Bed sheets were aired outside whenever the weather allowed. Hands were rinsed before meals if water was available. But full-body bathing happened rarely, very rarely. Sometimes months passed without anyone fully washing themselves. Instead, people changed linen garments beneath their outer clothes. Many believed the linen absorbed oils and impurities from the skin better than water ever could. His mother proudly boiled undergarments every week, convinced that fresh linen protected health more effectively than soaking in a tub. Elias once asked why rich families owned fancy bathtubs if bathing was considered dangerous. His mother lowered her voice before answering. Rich folk can afford doctors when bathing makes them ill. That explanation stayed with him for years. One bitter morning, Elias accompanied his father to deliver barrels to the home of Magistrate Holloway, one of the wealthiest men in the colony. Holloway's estate stood far from the crowded district near the docks. The air there smelled cleaner somehow, though smoke still drifted through the trees. Servants carried food into the kitchen, while horses stamped impatiently near the stable. As Elias rolled a barrel through the rear courtyard, he noticed steam rising from a small wooden structure beside the house. "What's that?" he whispered. His father stiffened slightly. "Bathhouse." Elias blinked in surprise. "They bathe there. Sometimes. Then why do people say bathing is dangerous?" His father tightened his jaw before answering. "Because too much bathing is dangerous." That answer made little sense to Elias, though adults often spoke that way. Everything in moderation. Too much laughter weakened discipline. Too much reading damaged the eyes. Too much meat overheated the blood. Too much bathing opened the body to sickness. The colony's physician, Dr. Nathaniel Pike, reinforced such beliefs constantly. He was a tall, thin man with powdered hair and permanently red fingertips from handling herbs and chemicals. Whenever illness spread through town, Pike blamed foul air, weakened humors, or reckless exposure to cold water. One Sunday after church, Elias watched the doctor lecture several townspeople near the square. "The body must remain balanced," Pike declared dramatically. "Sudden bathing shocks the system. Warm water softens the flesh and opens pathways for disease." Several listeners nodded nervously. "Then why do sailors wash in the sea?" someone asked. The doctor frowned. "And many sailors die young." That seemed to settle the matter. Elias noticed that people feared sickness almost superstitiously. Smallpox outbreaks haunted every family. Fevers appeared suddenly and killed within days. Children vanished to disease before reaching adulthood so often that grief became woven into ordinary life. People searched desperately for explanations. Water became one of many suspects. During springtime, the streets grew worse. Rain mixed with animal waste, ash, spoiled vegetables, and chamber pot runoff until the roads resembled dark soup. Children played through it without concern. Workers tracked mud directly into homes. Dogs slept beneath market tables chewing bones, while flies gathered in thick clouds around fish stalls. Yet despite all this dirt, many colonists still distrusted bathing more than filth itself. Elias struggled to understand. One afternoon, he visited his friend Samuel Reed near the docks. Samuel's father worked unloading cargo ships arriving from Europe and the Caribbean. The harbor fascinated Elias because sailors brought strange stories from distant places. That day, a weathered sailor from Spain sat outside a tavern drinking ale, while several boys gathered nearby listening to him speak. In Havana, the sailor said proudly, some people bathe every day. The boys stared at him in disbelief. Every day, Samuel repeated. The sailor laughed. Yes, especially in hot weather. That would kill a man here, another boy muttered. The sailor laughed even harder. No, boy, dirt kills faster. Elias remembered those words long afterward. That summer became unusually humid. Sweat soaked through clothing from morning until night. Mosquitoes swarmed near the riverbanks, while illness spread through poorer neighborhoods. Reverend Clark preached that moral weakness invited suffering upon the colony. Dr. Pike blamed spoiled air drifting from the marshes. Others whispered different theories. Some claimed newcomers from overseas carried hidden diseases in their bodies. Others blamed witches living beyond the woods. A few suspected contaminated wells, but nobody considered the town itself might simply be filthy beyond reason. One evening, Elias' younger sister, Mary, developed a terrible fever. She shivered violently beneath heavy blankets while their mother prayed softly nearby. Dr. Pike arrived carrying his leather medical bag filled with crude instruments and foul-smelling remedies. After examining Mary, he ordered warm broth, herbs, and strict avoidance of cold exposure. No bathing, he warned. Her body is already vulnerable. For 3 days, Mary drifted between sleep and delirium while the family waited helplessly. Elias barely left her bedside. He wiped sweat from her forehead using dry cloths because even touching cool water to her skin frightened his mother. When Mary finally recovered, the family thanked God repeatedly. Dr. Pike accepted the credit proudly. Water would have worsened the fever, he insisted. Elias wanted to believe him, yet doubts continued growing quietly inside his mind. Weeks later, he wandered toward the river alone at dawn, before most townspeople awoke. Mist floated above the water, while birds moved through tall reeds nearby. Elias crouched near the shoreline and touched the surface carefully. The water felt cool and strangely peaceful. He looked around nervously. Then, very slowly, he splashed water across his face. Nothing happened. No weakness entered his bones. No sickness invaded his body. No invisible demons crawled through his pores. Only coldness, refreshing coldness. For the first time in his life, Elias wondered whether the adults around him truly understood the world at all. Behind him, a sharp voice suddenly shattered the silence. "What are you doing?" Elias spun around in panic. An elderly woman named Ruth Carver stood several yards away, clutching a basket of laundry. Her expression looked horrified. "You'll make yourself sick, boy." Elias quickly stood upright. "I was only—" "Cold river water before sunrise," Ruth interrupted. "Have you lost your senses?" She hurried toward him, muttering prayers beneath her breath. "Your mother would faint if she saw this foolishness." Elias wiped water from his face awkwardly, while shame burned in his chest. Even after his private doubts, years of fear still clung tightly to him. Ruth marched him halfway home while lecturing about pneumonia, fever, and weakened lungs. By the time Elias returned to the workshop, he almost believed he already felt sick. His father noticed his nervous expression immediately. "What happened?" Elias hesitated. Then he admitted the truth. For several long seconds, his father said nothing. Finally, he sighed deeply and returned to hammering iron bands around a barrel. "You must be careful," he murmured quietly. "But I felt fine," Elias replied. For now, that answer frustrated him more than anger would have. Outside, church bells echoed faintly through the colony, while smoke drifted over crowded rooftops. Somewhere nearby, a child cried. A horse kicked against wood. Men shouted near the market. Life continued exactly as it always had. But inside Elias Turner, something had begun to change. And over the coming years, as disease, fear, superstition, and survival collided within the growing colony, he would slowly discover that people in colonial America feared bathing for reasons far stranger than simple dirt or discomfort. Some fears came from medicine. Some came from religion. Some came from old European traditions carried across the ocean. And some came from terrifying outbreaks that convinced entire communities that water itself could become an invisible doorway to death. The settlement did not yet realize it, but another brutal summer was approaching, and with it would come a sickness that would force Elias to question everything he had ever been taught about cleanliness, health, and the strange smell of colonial life itself. The summer heat arrived earlier than anyone expected, settling over the colony like a damp wool blanket that could not be removed. By mid-morning, the streets already shimmered beneath the heavy sun, and the smell drifting through town became almost unbearable. Rotting vegetables baked beside the market stalls. Animal waste softened in the mud until carts spread it across every road. Smoke from cook fires mixed with the odor of fish guts near the docks, creating a sour thickness in the air that clung to clothing and hair long after sunset. Elias Turner woke each morning, sweating beneath his blanket, even with the windows open. His mother complained constantly about the heat, though she still refused to allow full bathing inside the household. Instead, she soaked cloths in vinegar water and wiped the family's necks and hands, while insisting it was safer than immersing the body. "Water on the skin is enough," she said. "No reason to invite illness." Mary, now fully recovered from her fever months earlier, wrinkled her nose every time their mother scrubbed her face with vinegar. "It smells worse than the tannery," she groaned. Their father laughed quietly while shaping barrel staves beside the workshop wall. "Then perhaps it is working." The workshop stayed busy throughout the season because nearly everyone needed storage barrels during summer. Rainwater spoiled quickly in open containers, and clean drinking water became increasingly difficult to find near the crowded settlement. Wells turned cloudy after storms. River water carried filth from upstream farms and slaughterhouses. People drank weak beer or cider more often than plain water because fermented drinks were considered safer. Elias spent long days delivering barrels through different parts of town, and with every passing week, he noticed the colony changing beneath the oppressive heat. Tempers shortened. Arguments erupted in the marketplace over spoiled meat or stolen produce. Children wandered barefoot through muddy alleys with swollen mosquito bites covering their legs. Even church attendance declined slightly because the meeting house became suffocating during afternoon sermons. Yet, despite the discomfort, very few people considered bathing a solution. Many believed summer bathing was especially risky because heated skin supposedly absorbed disease faster. Dr. Nathaniel Pike repeated that warning often. The pores widen in hot weather, he explained during one gathering outside the church. Cold water entering the body too suddenly can shock the organs and invite deadly fever. Several women nodded nervously while fanning themselves. One elderly man claimed his cousin in Boston died 2 days after falling into a pond during July. Another swore that bathing weakened the heart. Stories like these spread quickly through the settlement until they hardened into accepted truth. Elias listened quietly, but no longer felt entirely convinced. Since his secret encounter with river water weeks earlier, curiosity continued growing inside him. Sometimes before dawn, he returned alone to the riverbank, splashing water onto his face and arms, while constantly looking over his shoulder in case someone appeared. Nothing terrible happened afterward. No coughing, no fever, no mysterious weakness. If anything, he felt better afterward, especially during the unbearable heat. Still, fear lingered deep in his mind. Years of warnings could not disappear easily. One evening, while unloading barrels near the harbor, Elias overheard 2 sailors arguing outside a tavern. Their shirts clung to their skin with sweat, and both men smelled strongly of rum. "I tell you," one sailor snapped, "the French wash far too often." The other laughed. "And yet they live." "Barely. Half of Europe rots from plague because folks soak themselves like vegetables in soup." Elias slowed his steps, pretending to adjust a barrel strap so he could continue listening. The second sailor lowered his voice. "You know what truly kills men aboard ships? Filth. Weeks without proper washing. Rats crawling over sleeping bodies. Water barrels fouled with slime." The first sailor spat into the mud. "Doesn't matter. My grandfather bathed twice in his life, and survived 70 years. That ended the discussion, as far as he was concerned. Elias walked home thinking about the argument long after sunset. Everyone seemed to believe different things about cleanliness. Some feared dirt, others feared water, most feared disease, without truly understanding where it came from. A few days later, trouble arrived quietly. It began near the poorer district beside the docks, where crowded boarding houses packed sailors, laborers, widows, and immigrants together in tiny, overheated rooms. A young dock worker developed stomach pains and violent fever. Within 2 days, he was dead. Then another laborer became sick. Then a washerwoman. Soon whispers moved through the colony, faster than smoke in the wind. Something was spreading. Dr. Pike blamed foul air drifting from the river marshes. Reverend Clark warned that sinful behavior invited divine punishment. Tavern owners insisted spoiled imported food caused the illness. Meanwhile, people grew increasingly terrified. The sick complained of cramps, vomiting, weakness, and unbearable thirst. Some recovered after several miserable days. Others died frighteningly fast. Elias first noticed the fear when customers stopped lingering near the workshop. Normally, neighbors chatted while collecting barrels or tools, but now people hurried home quickly, avoiding unnecessary conversation. Parents dragged children indoors before dusk. Church bells rang more frequently for funerals. At night, wagons carried bodies toward burial grounds outside town. Mary stopped sleeping well after hearing those wagons pass the house. "Are we going to die?" she whispered one evening while thunder rolled outside. Their mother pulled her close immediately. "Of course not," but her voice lacked confidence. Rain hammered the roof throughout the night, flooding the streets by morning. Brown water pooled between houses, carrying garbage, manure, dead rats, and kitchen waste together into slow-moving streams. Children were forbidden from playing outside, though some still splashed barefoot through the mud whenever adults looked away. Elias helped his father secure barrels beneath canvas coverings while the storm continued. "Too much rain after heat always brings sickness," his father muttered. "Why?" Elias asked. His father paused. "Because it does." Again, that same frustrating answer. "Because it does." No explanations. Only traditions repeated across generations. Later that afternoon, Elias visited Samuel Reed near the docks, despite his mother's objections. He found Samuel helping his father unload cargo from a recently arrived merchant ship. The sailors aboard looked exhausted and dirty, their clothes stiff with sweat and salt. One sailor leaned over the dock, coughing violently into the river. Samuel lowered his voice after noticing Elias starring. 3 men died during the voyage. From the sickness, maybe. Nearby, dock workers argued about whether the ship should even be allowed near the harbor. "They'll infect the whole colony," one man warned. Another shook his head. "Disease comes from bad air, not ships. A third insisted the illness spread through contaminated fabric. Everyone carried theories. Nobody carried certainty. As the days passed, fear transformed ordinary behavior throughout the settlement. Families burned herbs indoors, hopping to cleanse the air. Vinegar cloths covered faces during funerals. Some households sealed windows completely despite the heat. Others fled temporarily into the countryside. Bathing became even less common than before. People worried that exposing the body to water during an outbreak left them vulnerable to sickness. Mothers warned children not to swim in streams. Laborers avoided washing sweat from their skin after work. Dr. Pike encouraged such caution. The body fights disease best when left undisturbed, he declared publicly. Elias noticed something strange about the doctor himself, however. Despite preaching against excessive washing, Pike always appeared unusually clean compared to most townspeople. His cuffs stayed white. His powdered wig smelled faintly of lavender instead of sweat. One evening, Elias mentioned this to his father. Maybe doctors know secrets they do not share, he suggested. His father snorted quietly. Doctors know how to sound confident. That response surprised him. You don't trust Dr. Pike. I trust that he has buried many patients. Before Elias could ask more questions, loud shouting erupted outside. Several neighbors hurried down the street toward the Reed family home. Elias followed instinctively. Samuel's mother stood crying near the doorway, while Reverend Clark attempted to calm her. Through the open door, Elias saw Samuel's father lying motionless on a bed, his skin pale and damp with sweat. Samuel looked terrified. He was fine yesterday, he whispered. Dr. Pike arrived shortly afterward, carrying his medical bag. The crowd stepped aside immediately. After examining the sick man briefly, Pike ordered the windows shut. The night air will worsen his condition, but he can barely breathe, Samuel protested. Fresh air is not always healthy air, Pike replied sharply. The room became hotter by the minute after the windows closed completely. Elias stood outside feeling helpless, while muffled voices drifted from inside the house. Hours passed before Pike finally emerged, looking grim. Pray for him, the doctor announced quietly. By sunrise, Samuel's father was dead. The funeral occurred the next day, beneath crushing heat. Flies gathered around mourners, while Reverend Clark spoke solemnly about God's mysterious will. Samuel barely moved during the ceremony. Afterward, Elias walked beside him toward the river. Do you think the sickness came from the ship? Elias asked carefully. Samuel shook his head weakly. I don't know. They sat silently near the water for several minutes. Then Samuel admitted something in a whisper. My father bathed 3 days ago. Elias turned toward him. What? He said the heat was unbearable. Samuel swallowed hard. Dr. Pike warned him afterward that cold water during summer weekends the organs. The implication hung heavily between them. Samuel truly believed bathing might have killed his father. Elias wanted to argue, wanted to say that sickness surely came from something else. But he lacked proof. All around them, the colony continued sinking deeper into fear. The cemetery expanded weekly. Church attendance filled beyond capacity whenever Reverend Clark preached about divine punishment. People avoided physical contact whenever possible, and still the streets remained filthy. Dead animals sometimes lay for days before removal. Waste continued flowing through gutters into the river. Insects swarmed everywhere beneath the summer heat. One afternoon, Elias noticed workers hauling barrels of lime toward a burial trench outside town. Curious, he followed from a distance. The trench already contained several wrapped bodies. A laborer covering his nose with cloth muttered to another man nearby, "They say disease travels through smell. No wonder we're doomed then," the other replied grimly. That night, Elias could not sleep. The room felt suffocatingly hot. Sweat covered his skin beneath the blankets. Beside him, Mary tossed restlessly, while distant church bells echoed once more through the darkness. Finally, Elias slipped quietly outside. The colony lay silent, except for barking dogs and drunken voices near the taverns. Moonlight reflected faintly across the river beyond town. Without fully deciding to do it, Elias walked there. The water shimmered softly beneath the night sky. His heart pounded nervously as he removed his boots. Then slowly, cautiously, he stepped into the river. Coldness climbed around his ankles, then knees, then waist. For a terrifying moment, every warning from childhood screamed through his mind. Fever, weak lungs, death creeping invisibly through open pores. But another feeling soon replaced the fear. Relief, pure, overwhelming relief from the endless heat and sweat coating his body for weeks. Elias closed his eyes while river water drifted around him. For the first time in his entire life, he felt truly clean, and hidden beneath the darkness along the opposite bank, someone was watching him silently from the trees. Elias did not notice the figure watching from the trees until he heard the faint crack of a branch snapping somewhere beyond the riverbank. His eyes opened instantly. Moonlight shimmered across the black water, while insects buzzed loudly through the reeds. For one terrible moment, he imagined Dr. Pike standing there, ready to drag him back to town and publicly shame him for reckless behavior. Instead, an old man slowly stepped from the shadows. His clothes looked worn and uneven, more like patched blankets than proper colonial garments. A long gray beard covered most of his chest, and his boots appeared soaked with mud. He carried a fishing spear across one shoulder and smelled faintly of smoke and wet leaves. Elias froze waist deep in the river. The old man studied him quietly for several seconds. "You're either brave," he finally muttered, "or foolish. Elias hurried toward shore, embarrassed to be seen. I wasn't doing anything wrong. The stranger shrugged. Depends who you ask. Elias grabbed his boots nervously while trying to decide whether to run. The old man sat on a fallen log near the water without invitation. Town folk still afraid of bathing? He asked. Elias hesitated. Most are. The stranger scratched his beard. Funny creatures. You don't live in the settlement. Not anymore. The man pointed toward the river. Water's cleaner upstream. Less waste. Less death floating through it. Elias stared at him. Death? The old man gave a tired laugh. You think your colony buries everyone properly. A cold feeling crawled through Elias, despite the summer heat. The stranger noticed his expression and waved dismissively. Don't worry. River carried worse things long before your people arrived. For a while, neither spoke. Crickets chirped through the darkness, while distant thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the forest. Finally, Elias asked the question lingering in his mind. Does bathing really make people sick? The old man smirked. My wife bathed every week for 30 years. What happened to her? She got crushed by a tree during a storm. Elias blinked. That has nothing to do with bathing. Exactly. The stranger stood slowly, joints cracking beneath stiff clothing. Fear spreads easier than truth, boy. Always has. Before Elias could ask another question, the man disappeared back into the woods as quietly as he had appeared. Elias remained beside the river long afterward, thinking about those words. Fear spreads easier than truth. Back in the colony, fear had now infected nearly everything. The sickness continued claiming lives across the settlement. Entire households stayed indoors for days after someone developed fever. Shops closed early. Dock activity slowed as sailors refused to unload certain ships rumored to carry plague. At night, funeral bells echoed so often they no longer shocked anyone. Yet the strangest change involved smell. People became obsessed with covering bad odors. Bundles of herbs hung inside homes. Women carried scented cloths pressed against their noses. Vinegar bowls sat beside beds. Men stuffed tobacco leaves into pockets, believing strong smells protected the lungs from disease. But almost nobody questioned why the town smelled terrible in the first place. Elias noticed this contradiction everywhere he went. One afternoon, he delivered barrels near the butcher district, where animal blood flowed through shallow street gutters beneath buzzing clouds of flies. 2 women nearby covered their noses with lavender cloths while stepping carefully around piles of rotting scraps. The stench carries sickness, one woman whispered. Elias looked at the decaying waste, only feet away. Surely that mattered more than whether someone bathed. But he stayed silent. At home, his mother had grown increasingly anxious since the outbreak began. She scrubbed the floors with vinegar daily and burned rosemary branches indoors until smoke filled every room. No river visits, she warned repeatedly, especially during sickness. Elias nodded each time, without admitting the truth. Meanwhile, Mary became fascinated by death in the strange way children sometimes do. She constantly asked questions during dinner. How many people died today? Does sickness hurt? Can ghosts catch fever? Their mother hated such conversations. Enough, she snapped one evening. People are suffering, but suffering had become impossible to ignore. A neighbor named Mrs. Bartlett lost 2 children within the same week. A carpenter collapsed while working near the church and died before sunset. Several fishermen disappeared after developing symptoms aboard their boat. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. Some believed foreigners poisoned the wells. Others claimed punishment from God had fallen upon the colony because taverns remained open on Sundays. A few whispered that witches near the forest cursed the settlement after being driven away years earlier. Dr. Pike blamed foul vapors rising from filth and stagnant water. Ironically, despite blaming stagnant water, he still warned strongly against bathing. The body must preserve its natural protective oils, he explained during a town meeting crowded with frightened colonists. Excessive washing weakens resistance. Elias listened from the back of the crowd beside Samuel Reed, who looked thinner every week since his father's death. Samuel no longer argued with adults, no longer laughed much either. After the meeting ended, Elias quietly asked him something. Do you really think your father died because he bathed? Samuel stared at the muddy ground. I don't know what to think anymore. That answer frightened Elias more than certainty would have. A few days later, the heat became nearly unbearable. Even nighttime offered little relief. Sweat soaked through bedsheets, while mosquitoes swarmed thickly enough to darken windows. People slept outdoors despite fears about unhealthy night air because houses felt like ovens. Elias worked shirtless beside the barrel workshop one afternoon, while his father repaired cracked storage casks. You should cover your skin, his mother warned from the doorway. The heat's killing me already, Elias muttered. His father suddenly stopped hammering. Maybe we should close early. Elias looked surprised. His father almost never abandoned work before sunset, but the older man appeared exhausted. Sweat dripped from his beard, while his face looked unusually pale beneath layers of dust and sawdust. You feeling all right? Elias asked. Just tired. That evening, his father barely touched supper. By midnight, he developed chills. The next morning, fever arrived. Panic filled the Turner household immediately. Mary cried quietly while their mother rushed to prepare herbal remedies. Elias ran for Dr. Pike through streets, already steaming beneath the rising sun. The physician arrived, carrying his familiar leather bag. After examining Elias' father, Pike frowned deeply. The illness has reached many strong men lately. Their mother clasped her hands tightly. Will he recover? Perhaps, perhaps, such a terrible word. Dr. Pike ordered windows partially covered to avoid dangerous drafts while maintaining balanced air circulation. He prescribed bitter tonic mixtures and strict bed rest. Most importantly, he forbade any exposure to cold water, not even for comfort, he warned firmly. The body must sweat out the sickness naturally. For 3 days, Elias watched his father burn with fever beneath heavy blankets, while flies circled the room endlessly. Sweat soaked the bedsheets until the air smelled sour and damp. Sometimes, his father rambled incoherently about unfinished barrels or winter storms from years earlier. At one point, he grabbed Elias' wrist weakly. "Water," he whispered. Their mother immediately lifted a cup to his lips. But later, when the fever worsened, Elias noticed his father's dry, cracked skin and remembered the cool relief of the river. An idea formed quietly in his mind. Dangerous, forbidden, but impossible to ignore. That night, while everyone slept, Elias soaked a cloth in cool well water and gently pressed it against his father's forehead. The older man sighed softly, almost immediately. Relief crossed his face for the first time in days. Elias replaced the cloth several times through the night. By dawn, the fever had not vanished, but his father seemed calmer. Then disaster struck. His mother entered the room unexpectedly and saw the damp cloth resting across the sick man's chest. Her expression filled with horror. "What have you done?" Elias stood quickly. He was overheating. "You used cold water." "A little. Are you trying to kill him?" Her voice shook so loudly Mary woke, instantly, in the next room. "You've opened his body to worse sickness." Elias stared at her in disbelief. He looked better. "Because fever tricks the senses," she snapped. She ripped away the wet cloth immediately and threw it into the fireplace. "You listen to doctors, not foolish river instincts." When Dr. Pike returned later that afternoon, Elias' mother informed him about the incident before Elias could explain. The physician's face hardened. Cooling the body too suddenly during fever is extremely dangerous. But he seemed relieved. Elias argued quietly. Relief is not recovery. Dr. Pike mixed more herbs into steaming water. The body heals through balance. Young people think comfort equals cure. Elias bit his tongue to avoid arguing further. Still deep inside, doubt continued growing. That evening, Samuel visited briefly, bringing soup from his mother. After hearing about Elias' father, he looked genuinely frightened. "The sickness takes people fast," he whispered. Elias nodded silently. Outside, thunderclouds gathered above the colony, while humid wind rattled loose shutters. The streets already smelled worse than ever after weeks of heat and death. Somewhere near the docks, men shouted while unloading another arriving ship despite fears of infection. Life staggered onward through exhaustion and uncertainty. Late that night, Elias sat alone outside the workshop, staring toward the dark river beyond town. His father coughed violently inside the house, while rain began falling softly across the rooftops. Then he noticed someone approaching through the misty street. Dr. Pike, the physician, moved quickly beneath the rain, carrying his leather bag. But instead of entering another patient's house nearby, Pike stopped beside the Turner workshop and glanced around carefully, as if ensuring nobody watched him. Curious, Elias remained hidden behind stacked barrels. To his shock, Dr. Pike quietly removed his coat, walked toward a rain barrel beneath the roof gutter, and began washing his hands and face thoroughly with collected rainwater. Not a quick rinse, a careful washing. Again and again, Elias stared from the darkness in complete disbelief. The doctor who warned everyone against bathing was secretly cleaning himself in the middle of the night. Rain continued falling softly over the colony, while Elias remained frozen behind the stacked barrels, watching Dr. Pike wash himself beneath the gutter runoff like a man terrified of being seen. The physician scrubbed his hands carefully, rubbing each finger with unusual attention before splashing water across his face and neck. Muddy rainwater dripped from his powdered wig onto the ground below. Every few moments, Pike glanced nervously toward the street, as though expecting someone to appear. Elias could barely believe what he was seeing. This was the same man who warned families that cold water weakened the organs. The same doctor who scolded Elias for cooling his father's fever with a damp cloth. Yet here he stood in the darkness, secretly washing himself more thoroughly than most townspeople ever did. For several seconds, Elias considered stepping forward immediately, asking questions, demanding answers. But before he could move, Pike stopped suddenly and stared down at his own hands beneath the rainwater. Even in the darkness, Elias noticed something strange. The doctor's hands were trembling, not from cold, from fear. Pike quickly dried himself using a cloth from his bag, then pulled his coat tightly around his body before disappearing into the rainy street without noticing Elias hiding nearby. Long after the physician vanished, Elias remained motionless beneath the workshop awning, listening to rain strike the rooftops. Something about the scene disturbed him deeply. Not merely the hypocrisy, the fear. Dr. Pike looked like a man trying desperately to protect himself from something invisible. Inside the house, his father groaned weakly through another coughing fit. Elias finally returned indoors, where the heavy smell of sweat, herbs, damp blankets, and sickness filled every room. His mother sat beside the bed half asleep, in a chair. "How is he?" Elias whispered. "No worse." That was the closest thing to hopeful news they had received in days. Throughout the night, Elias kept thinking about Pike washing his hands. Why secretly? Why hide something he publicly condemned? And why did he look so frightened afterward? By morning, the rainstorm had ended, leaving the streets flooded with brown, stagnant water. Pigs rooted through floating garbage, while children poked dead fish trapped near drainage ditches. The entire colony smelled like wet ash and rot beneath the rising heat. Elias stepped outside, carrying spoiled straw from the workshop, when he overheard two neighbors talking nearby. They say the sickness spreads faster after rain because bad air rises from the mud. No, the other whispered nervously. My cousin says it clings to skin. Elias paused. Clings to skin. The phrase echoed strangely in his mind after witnessing Pike's secret washing. Later that afternoon, Dr. Pike returned to check on Elias' father. The physician looked exhausted. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes, and his wig sat crooked as though he had barely slept. After examining the patient, Pike sighed quietly. The fever may be breaking. Relief flooded the room instantly. Their mother nearly cried from gratitude. Elias studied the doctor carefully. Clean hands, fresh-smelling coat, no visible sweat, despite the heat outside. Finally, Elias spoke carefully. Doctor, why does water help some illnesses, but worsen others? Pike glanced at him briefly. Medicine is complicated, but last night, Elias stopped himself. The doctor's expression sharpened instantly. Last night what? For a moment, silence filled the room. Elias nearly revealed everything. Instead, he lowered his eyes. Nothing. Pike stared at him a second longer before returning attention to the patient. But something had changed. The physician now looked at Elias differently. Cautiously, after Pike departed, Elias walked toward the market, trying to clear his thoughts. The colony buzzed with exhausted tension beneath the humid afternoon sky. Funeral wagons rolled regularly through the streets now, often carrying multiple bodies beneath stained cloth coverings. Shopkeepers burned herbs outside doorways, hopping to purify the air for customers. Near the church square, a crowd gathered around Reverend Clark, who preached loudly about moral decay. Clean souls matter more than clean bodies, he declared while sweat soaked through his collar. Vanity invites weakness. Several listeners murmured agreement. One elderly woman claimed excessive bathing encouraged sinful behavior because it made people overly concerned with appearance. Another insisted frequent washing resembled European aristocratic habits, which many colonists distrusted. Elias realized bathing fears reached beyond medicine alone. Religion, tradition, class resentment, superstition, everything tangled together, until nobody could separate truth from habit anymore. As he continued walking, he spotted Samuel Reed sitting alone beside the dock warehouse, staring toward the harbor. You look terrible, Samuel muttered when Elias approached. Thanks, Samuel shrugged. You know what I mean. Elias sat beside him quietly. Several ships floated offshore under quarantine orders, while smaller boats delivered supplies carefully from a distance. Rumors claimed entire crews aboard some vessels were sick. What if none of the doctors know anything? Elias asked suddenly. Samuel laughed weakly. That would explain a lot. Elias hesitated before speaking again. I saw Dr. Pike washing himself last night. Samuel frowned. Washing with rainwater carefully, like he was afraid. Samuel stared at him. But he tells everyone bathing is dangerous. I know. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Samuel lowered his voice. My father used to say rich people follow different rules. What do you mean? He delivered lumber to a wealthy estate once. Said they had private bathing rooms inside. Elias remembered Magistrate Holloway's bathhouse immediately. Maybe rich folk can afford the risk, he muttered. Or maybe they know something we don't. The thought lingered heavily between them. That evening, Elias returned home to discover his father sitting upright for the first time in days. Weak and pale, yes, but alive. Their mother thanked God repeatedly while preparing broth over the fire. You're improving, Elias said quietly. His father nodded slowly. Still feel like death chewed me up. Mary laughed nervously with relief. For the first time in weeks, hope returned briefly to the Turner household. But outside their home, the colony continued unraveling. Food shortages worsened as farmers avoided town markets out of fear. Several businesses closed completely after losing workers to illness. Grave diggers demanded higher pay because burial grounds expanded daily. Worst of all, people grew suspicious of one another. Families avoided neighbors showing signs of cough or fever. Travelers received hostile looks upon entering town. Some residents blamed immigrants, while others accused sailors. One violent fight erupted near the taverns after a drunken laborer claimed foreign merchants poisoned local wells. Fear was becoming uglier. A few nights later, Elias again slipped away toward the river after everyone slept. The heat remained unbearable indoors despite cooler weather arriving slowly from the north. This time, he found the old bearded stranger already waiting near the riverbank, repairing fishing nets beside a lantern. You came back, the man said without looking up. Elias sat nearby. People are dying everywhere. They usually are. You know what I mean. The old man nodded slightly. Town sickness. Dr. Pike says bad air spreads it. Maybe, but he secretly washes himself. That finally caught the old man's attention. He looked up slowly. Does he now? Elias explained what he had witnessed in the rain. The stranger listened carefully before giving a quiet grunt. Interesting. You don't sound surprised. Boy, people with power often preach one thing while practicing another. But why? The old man tossed part of the fishing net aside. Because fear keeps folk obedient. Elias frowned. You think he's lying. I think your doctor's trying not to die. The river moved lazily behind them, beneath moonlight. Finally, Elias asked the question haunting him most. Do you think washing helps prevent sickness? The old man rubbed his beard thoughtfully. When I worked trapping north of here, I met native tribes who washed in rivers often, sweated in steam lodges too, and they weren't dropping dead from bathing. Elias absorbed this silently. Then why are colonists so afraid of it? The stranger smiled faintly. Old ideas survive long after they stop making sense. That answer felt painfully true. Before leaving, the old man handed Elias a small cloth pouch. What's this? Dried mint leaves. Better smell than vinegar. Elias laughed quietly for the first time in weeks. As he walked back toward town, however, he noticed torchlight moving rapidly through the streets ahead. Too many torches. Voices shouted urgently near the church square. Something had happened. Elias hurried closer. A crowd gathered outside Dr. Pike's home. Women cried openly, while several men carried buckets of water toward the house. Smoke drifted through the night air. Fire. One upstairs window glowed orange beneath rising flames. Move back, someone shouted. Elias pushed through the crowd, searching for answers. Then he spotted Samuel near the front. What happened? Elias demanded. Samuel looked pale. Someone says Pike burned contaminated bedding. Another loud crash echoed from inside the house as sparks burst upward into the sky. Suddenly, the front door opened. Dr. Pike stumbled outside, coughing violently. People rushed forward immediately, but Elias noticed something horrifying. The doctor's hands, bright red burns, covered both palms and wrists, and despite the chaos surrounding him, Pike kept screaming the same words again and again. Wash them, wash your hands. The crowd stared in stunned confusion. Several people exchanged nervous looks. One woman crossed herself fearfully. Dr. Pike grabbed a nearby man by the coat. Wash before touching the sick, he shouted desperately. But doctor, the man stammered. You said. I was wrong, Pike screamed. Silence fell across the crowd. Even the fire suddenly seemed quieter. Elias felt cold, despite the summer night, because for the first time since the sickness began, the colony's most trusted physician looked less like a confident doctor and more like a terrified man who had discovered something too late. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The crowd simply stared at Dr. Pike, while sparks drifted upward into the smoky night sky. The physician stood barefoot in the mud outside his burning home, hands blistered red from the fire, chest rising violently with each breath. Wash your hands, he repeated hoarsely. Before meals, before touching the sick, before touching wounds. A strange unease spread through the people gathered around him, not because the advice sounded dangerous, because it sounded completely different from everything he had preached for years. One man near the back shook his head nervously. The fires affected his mind. Another whispered that smoke inhalation caused confusion. But Elias noticed something else. Dr. Pike looked desperate, not mad, not delirious, desperate. Buckets of water continued passing between townsmen as flames consumed the upper floor of Pike's house. The physician suddenly turned toward the burning doorway, as though remembering something important still remained inside. "My journals," he muttered. Before anyone could stop him, he lunged toward the entrance. 2 men grabbed him immediately. "You'll die in there." "Let me go," Pike shouted. "Those papers matter." The roof above the doorway cracked loudly as sparks exploded into the darkness. Even Pike finally realized entering the building would be suicide. He collapsed to his knees, coughing, while smoke drifted around him. Reverend Clark arrived moments later, wrapped in a night robe beneath his heavy coat. His expression darkened immediately at the sight of the fire. What happened here? Nobody answered clearly, because nobody truly knew. Some claimed a candle, overturned. Others whispered about contaminated medical supplies. A few already muttered suspiciously about divine punishment. Elias stood near Samuel, watching everything unfold with growing confusion. Then Pike suddenly noticed Elias within the crowd. Their eyes locked. For one uncomfortable moment, Elias thought the physician might reveal their secret connection somehow. Instead, Pike spoke quietly. "You," Elias stepped forward cautiously. "Help me tomorrow." The crowd murmured immediately. Dr. Pike rarely requested assistance from anyone outside trained apprentices. "What for?" Elias asked. Pike looked exhausted beyond words. "To clean the infirmary." Several nearby listeners exchanged uneasy glances. "Clean," another strange word coming from the colony's most respected physician. Reverend Clark frowned deeply. "The boy has family responsibilities." Pike slowly stood, despite trembling legs. "And if the infirmary remains filthy, Reverend, more families will bury their children." Silence followed. Even Clark seemed unsure how to respond. Finally, the Reverend adjusted his coat stiffly. "Very well." The fire burned until nearly dawn. By sunrise, little remained of Pike's upper floor, besides blackened beams and drifting smoke. Curious townspeople gathered around the ruins, whispering theories, while children searched the mud for scraps of scorched metal. Elias barely slept before reporting to the infirmary later that morning. The building stood beside the church square, separated from most homes, because sick patients often stayed there during severe outbreaks. Usually, Elias avoided the place entirely. The smell alone frightened him. Today, the odor hit him before he even reached the door. Rot, sweat, vomiting, herbs, blood, everything mixed beneath the summer heat into something almost unbearable. Inside, patients lay across narrow beds, while exhausted assistants moved between them, carrying bowls and cloths. Some sufferers groaned weakly. Others stared blankly toward the ceiling with hollow eyes. Dr. Pike looked worse than anyone there. His burned hands were wrapped in linen bandages, and dark soot still stained parts of his face. Yet, despite exhaustion, he moved through the infirmary with strange urgency. "You came," he muttered upon seeing Elias. "You asked me to." Pike nodded toward several buckets near the doorway. "Bring fresh water." Elias blinked. Fresh water from the north well, not the river. That instruction alone sounded unusual enough. Then Pike handed him a rough piece of soap. "Soap?" Elias stared at it in surprise. Most families own soap, mainly for laundry or cleaning tools. Using it regularly on skin remained uncommon because many people considered harsh scrubbing unhealthy. Pike noticed his hesitation. "Wash your hands." Elias obeyed slowly while watching the physician carefully. Afterward, Pike instructed him to scrub tables, bed frames, door handles, and medical instruments repeatedly throughout the day. Everything touched by the sick, Pike insisted. Several infirmary assistants looked confused by the sudden changes. One older nurse finally asked what everyone else wondered. "Doctor, why are we doing this?" Pike stopped beside a patient's bed. "Because I think sickness spreads through contact more than we understood." The nurse frowned. "But you always said." "I know what I said." His voice carried sharp frustration. The woman fell silent immediately. Throughout the day, Elias watched Pike behave unlike the confident physician everyone knew. He washed constantly now. Hands, tools, cloths, surfaces. Whenever he touched blood or vomit, he cleaned himself afterward using boiled water and soap. Fear remained visible in every movement. At one point, Elias quietly approached him. "What changed your mind?" Pike stared toward the crowded beds before answering. "I served briefly in London during a fever outbreak years ago." "You never mentioned that." "Because most physicians dismissed what I observed there." He lowered his voice further. "One surgeon insisted disease traveled from patient to patient through dirty hands and contaminated instruments." Elias listened closely. "Was he right?" I laughed at him. Pike's expression tightened painfully. Everyone laughed at him. A weak coughing fit interrupted the conversation nearby. Pike hurried away immediately, leaving Elias alone with his thoughts. As the afternoon heat intensified, more patients arrived. One woman carried a feverish child wrapped in blankets, despite sweat pouring down the boy's face. An elderly fisherman staggered inside, barely able to stand. Two dockworkers brought their sick companion using a wheelbarrow because no wagon driver would transport him. The colony's fear had grown so severe that many workers abandoned ill neighbors entirely. Elias helped clean empty beds between patients while trying not to breathe too deeply. Several times, he noticed Pike quietly ordering fresh linens for patients instead of reusing dirty ones. Such habits previously seemed unnecessary to most people. Now the doctor treated cleanliness like warfare. Near sunset, Reverend Clark visited the infirmary carrying a Bible beneath one arm. His expression soured immediately after noticing Elias scrubbing tables with soap. "What exactly is happening here?" he demanded. Pike removed his spectacles tiredly. "An attempt to stop people dying. Through washing furniture. Through reducing contamination." The Reverend frowned. "You speak as though disease behaves like spilled wine." Pike stepped closer. "Perhaps it does." Clark looked deeply uncomfortable. "But illness comes through God's will and filthy conditions." The room fell silent. Several assistants stopped working entirely to listen. Reverend Clark stiffened beneath the criticism. "You challenge divine order." "I challenge ignorance," Pike snapped. Elias had never heard the physician speak that way before. Not to a reverend. Not publicly. Clark's face reddened. "For years, this colony trusted your guidance. And for years, I repeated theories older men taught me." Pike gestured toward the crowded sickbeds. "Look around you." The Reverend said nothing, because there was nothing comforting left to say. Death surrounded them after Clark departed angrily. Pike leaned heavily against a table, looking suddenly ancient beneath the dim candlelight. "I'm tired, Elias." The confession sounded painfully honest. Elias hesitated before asking another question. "Do you think bathing helps?" Pike looked at him carefully. "Not excessive soaking in filthy shared tubs, but washing." "Yes." The answer landed like thunder inside Elias' mind. Everything adults taught him since childhood suddenly felt unstable. Then why tell people otherwise? Pike closed his eyes briefly. Because medicine fears changing its mind. Outside, the infirmary evening shadows stretched across the colony, while church bells rang once again for another funeral. Smoke drifted above rooftops from dozens of cooking fires, blending with the endless odor of mud and waste. Elias walked home through streets that now looked different somehow. Not cleaner. Worse. Far worse. He noticed details previously ignored all his life. Butchers wiping bloody hands onto aprons before touching meat. Children coughing beside public wells. Flies landing on food uncovered in the market. Workers sharing cups without washing them. Laundry soaking beside animal troughs. The entire colony suddenly resembled a giant sickness, spreading itself endlessly from hand to hand. At home, his mother greeted him anxiously. "Where have you been?" "At the infirmary." Her face paled immediately. "With the sick?" Dr. Pike asked for help. Mary looked horrified. "You're going to catch the fever." Elias moved directly toward the wash basin near the hearth. His mother stared in confusion as he reached for soap. "What are you doing?" "Cleaning my hands." "You already washed this morning." "I touched sick people." Silence settled heavily across the room. Then his father, still weak from illness, but finally recovering, spoke quietly from his chair. "Maybe let the boy wash." Their mother looked between them, uncertainly, but too much washing didn't stop me getting sick. His father interrupted gently. That ended the discussion. Later that night, Elias sat outside beneath cooler air, finally arriving after weeks of suffocating heat. The colony remained restless around him. Somewhere nearby, drunken voices argued outside a tavern, while wagon wheels rattled through muddy streets. Then Samuel appeared carrying a lantern. "I heard Pike gone mad," Samuel said immediately. Elias almost laughed. "Maybe he's becoming sane." Samuel sat beside him, looking confused. Elias explained everything happening at the infirmary. The washing, the cleaning, the doctor's new theories. Samuel listened silently. Finally, he whispered something almost afraid to say aloud. "If he's right, then maybe my father didn't die from bathing." Elias looked toward the dark street. "No," he said quietly. "Maybe he died because nobody understood how sickness truly spread." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then suddenly, shouting erupted somewhere near the market square. More shouting followed. Angry shouting. Samuel stood quickly. "What now?" People began hurrying through the streets, carrying lanterns toward the noise. Elias and Samuel followed instinctively until they reached the crowded square. A furious mob surrounded the public pump near the center of town. Men shouted accusations, while women pulled children away from the area. At the center of the chaos stood Reverend Clark, beside several town leaders, and beside the pump workers were digging. One of them lifted something from the mud below. A dead pig, bloated, rotting, floating directly inside the colony's main water source. The crowd recoiled instantly as the dead pig emerged from the muddy pit beneath the public pump. Several women screamed. One man gagged loudly before stumbling backward into the street. The swollen animal dripped foul brown water, while flies exploded into the air around it. For weeks, much of the colony had drawn drinking water from that very pump. A horrible silence settled over the square before the shouting began again, even louder than before. "Dear God, no wonder everyone's dying. Who let this happen?" Workers struggled to drag the carcass fully onto the street, while Reverend Clark covered his mouth with a cloth soaked in vinegar. Nearby townsmen argued furiously about whether the pump should be sealed immediately. "It poisoned the water," someone shouted. Another man pointed angrily toward the crowded immigrant district. "I told you this town's become filthy beyond saving." Fear quickly transformed into blame. It always did. Elias pushed closer beside Samuel, both staring at the bloated animal beneath lantern light. The smell alone felt almost solid in the humid night air. Rotting flesh mixed with mud and stagnant water until breathing became difficult. One older woman collapsed crying after realizing her family drank from the pump daily. Dr. Pike arrived minutes later, carrying a lantern in one hand and his his medical bag in the other. The crowd parted uneasily for him. The physician stopped cold after seeing the carcass. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then he whispered quietly to himself, "So that's it." Reverend Clark turned sharply. "What?" Pike stepped toward the pump, carefully despite the stench. "The sickness." A nearby merchant frowned. "You think the pig caused all this?" "I think contaminated water helped spread it." Murmurs rolled through the crowd immediately. Some looked confused, others openly skeptical. "But disease comes from foul air," one man protested. Pike pointed directly at the pump. "And what creates foul air faster than rot inside drinking water?" The crowd quieted slightly, not convinced, but listening. Samuel leaned toward Elias. "My father drank from this pump constantly." Elias felt sick hearing that. Dr. Pike ordered the area sealed immediately. Workers hammered boards around the pump, while angry residents demanded answers from town officials. How long was it down there? What else is in the wells? Why didn't anyone inspect it? No one knew. Or perhaps nobody had cared enough to check. The colony grew rapidly every year, but sanitation remained almost non-existent. Waste pits overflowed regularly. Animal carcasses were dumped near streams. Wells sat dangerously close to privies and garbage heaps. People feared bathing while living surrounded by contamination. The contradiction now seemed almost absurd. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Elias noticed Pike staring into the muddy hole beneath the pump with exhausted eyes. "You suspected water?" Elias asked quietly. Pike rubbed soot-stained fingers across his forehead. "I suspected many things, but not this." "No." The physician looked genuinely ashamed. "For years, we argued about vapors, while people drank filth." Nearby Reverend Clark still appeared deeply unsettled. "You cannot prove the pig caused the illness," he insisted. Pike turned sharply. "I don't need certainty to recognize poison." The Reverend frowned. "You speak as though science replaces faith." "No," Pike replied tiredly. "I speak as a man burying patients faster than prayers can comfort families." That ended the argument. By morning, the entire colony knew about the dead pig. Panic spread immediately. Families emptied water barrels into the streets. Long lines formed at cleaner wells outside town. Some residents boiled water frantically, while others refused drinking anything except ale or cider. Rumors exaggerated everything further. By noon, some claimed multiple animal corpses were hidden beneath every pump in town. Others insisted enemies poisoned the colony deliberately. One woman swore demons lived inside the wells. Fear had finally attached itself directly to water. But unlike previous fears about bathing, this danger felt real. Dr. Pike spent the next several days inspecting wells personally alongside a few volunteers, including Elias and Samuel. The work was disgusting. They discovered slime, dead rats, insects, and rotting debris contaminating several public water sources. At one shallow well near the tannery, the smell alone nearly made Samuel vomit. "We've been drinking this," he muttered in horror. Pike looked grim. Probably for years, workers began cleaning wells thoroughly, while town leaders argued endlessly about costs and responsibility. Some wealthy landowners resisted funding repairs because they preferred using private water sources anyway. Poorer families suffered most. As always, meanwhile, the sickness continued spreading, though Pike noticed something strange. Households boiling water and improving cleanliness appeared to recover slightly more often. Not always, but enough to matter. The physician became obsessed. He ordered infirmary assistants to wash hands before tending patients. Dirty linens were burned instead of reused. Floors were scrubbed daily. Fresh air circulated through open windows despite older beliefs about dangerous drafts. Some townspeople mocked the changes openly. Others slowly copied them. Elias noticed small differences throughout the colony. Women washing cups more carefully. Children told to clean hands before eating. Taverns boiling utensils. Even Reverend Clark quietly installed wash basins outside the church after several parishioners became sick following crowded services. Old habits resisted change stubbornly, but fear pushed people toward experimentation. One afternoon, Elias accompanied Pike to visit a wealthy merchant family whose youngest daughter suffered severe fever. Their estate stood far cleaner than most homes in town. Polished furniture, swept floors, fresh-smelling linens, and beside the upstairs bedroom, a bathing room, a real indoor bathing room, copper tub, clean towels, perfumed soap. Elias stared openly. Pike noticed the wealthy often ignore rules meant for common folk. The statement carried bitterness. As they treated the sick girl, Elias quietly asked the merchant's wife how often the family bathed. "Once or twice weekly," she answered casually. Elias almost laughed from disbelief. Outside the estate afterward, he confronted Pike directly. "You knew rich families bathed regularly." Pike sighed. "Yes, and they weren't dying from it. Some still became ill, but not because of bathing." The physician stopped walking. No, that single word felt heavier than everything else. Years of fear, generations of superstition, so much suffering tied to beliefs nobody truly questioned. Elias suddenly remembered the old bearded stranger beside the river. Fear spreads easier than truth. The colony itself now stood caught between those two forces. As summer slowly weakened into early autumn, conditions improved slightly. Cooler air reduced the terrible smell hanging over town. Fewer new patients arrived at the infirmary each week. Funeral bells rang less often. People cautiously allowed themselves hope again, but the outbreak left scars everywhere. Dozens of homes stood empty after entire families died or fled. Businesses collapsed. Children wandered orphaned through the streets. Graveyards expanded beyond their fences, and trust in old ideas had begun cracking. One evening, Elias sat outside the workshop, helping his recovering father repair broken barrel hoops. The older man remained thinner after surviving the sickness, but strength slowly returned to his hands. "You were right about the cool cloths," his father admitted quietly. Elias looked surprised. "I wasn't trying to prove anything." "Still helped." The older man hammered another iron band into place. "When I was young, my father claimed winter air caused toothaches." Elias smiled faintly. "Did it?" "No, rotten teeth did." They both laughed softly. It felt strange hearing laughter again after so many dark months. Nearby, Mary practiced writing letters in the dirt while their mother boiled laundry over the fire. More often now, she washed things using soap instead of only vinegar. Small changes, but real ones. Later that night, Samuel arrived, carrying 2 wrapped bundles beneath his arm. "What's that?" Elias asked. Samuel grinned for the first time in weeks. "Soap." "Why are you carrying soap around like treasure?" "Because the merchant near the docks sold out this morning." Elias blinked. "People are buying it." Apparently, everyone's terrified of dirty hands now. The irony nearly made them both laugh again. The colony had spent generations fearing water touching skin. Now residents scrubbed themselves anxiously after every rumor of illness. Human beings changed slowly, until suddenly changing all at once. Over the following weeks, Elias noticed more visible shifts throughout town. Public wells received regular inspections. Waste pits moved farther from homes. Some families even began occasional full-body bathing, though many still treated it cautiously. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Certain older colonists insisted the new obsession with washing would create weak future generations. Reverend Clark continued preaching moderation, warning against vanity and European excess, but even he washed his hands publicly before meals now. Dr. Pike himself became quieter after the outbreak. The confident certainty he once carried had disappeared. Instead, he spent long hours rewriting medical notes salvaged from memory after the fire destroyed many original journals. One chilly evening, Elias visited the infirmary and found Pike alone beside candlelight, writing furiously with bandaged hands. "What are you working on?" Elias asked. "A record." "For what?" "So future doctors avoid repeating my mistakes." The physician looked older than ever. "I told people bathing invited sickness while they lived surrounded by filth." He shook his head slowly. "Strange blindness. You were trying to help. I was trying to sound certain." That answer lingered painfully in the room. Outside, autumn wind rattled dead leaves across the dark streets. The colony finally smelled cleaner after months of cooler weather and improved sanitation. Not pleasant exactly, but less rotten. Pike closed his journal carefully. Most dangerous ideas survive because they feel familiar, he said quietly. Elias nodded. And because people repeat them. Yes. The physician stared toward the infirmary windows, where moonlight touched the glass. Sometimes entire societies become afraid of the wrong things. Elias thought about that long after leaving. The fear of bathing had never appeared completely from nowhere. Cold rivers truly could worsen illness in certain situations. Shared public bathhouses sometimes spread infection horribly. Dirty standing water carried disease, but somewhere across generations, caution transformed into superstition, and superstition hardened into unquestioned truth. Back at home, the Turner family prepared for winter together, while smoke drifted peacefully above the rooftops. The colony remained scarred, grieving, imperfect, yet slowly changing. That night before sleep, Elias stepped outside, carrying a small basin of warmed water and soap. The air felt cold enough to sting his skin. Still, beneath the quiet stars, he carefully washed away the dirt covering his hands and face, not because he feared water anymore, but because he finally understood what truly frightened people all along. It was never bathing itself. It was the terrifying realization that human beings could spend entire lifetimes believing something completely wrong, while death quietly spread around them unnoticed. Winter arrived hard and early that year. Thin ice formed along the edges of the river before most families finished preparing firewood supplies. And bitter wind pushed smoke sideways through the colony's crooked streets. The outbreak had weakened too many workers during the summer, leaving roofs unrepaired, fences broken, and food stores smaller than usual. Yet, despite the cold, the settlement felt different now. Not happier exactly, but changed. Outside several homes, wash basins sat beside doorways where families cleaned their hands before meals. Public wells were inspected weekly by order of the town council. Waste pits farther from residential streets reduced some of the horrible smells that once drifted constantly through the colony. And perhaps strangest of all, soap had become valuable. The merchant near the harbor sold out repeatedly. Housewives traded candles, cloth, and dried herbs for extra bars. One tavern owner even advertised that cups were properly washed between customers, which sounded absurd enough to make older residents laugh openly. Still, not everyone embraced the new habits. Many colonists remained suspicious of excessive cleaning. Some older men insisted too much washing softened hardworking people. Others muttered that modern ideas always arrived from cities alongside moral corruption. Reverend Clark himself continued preaching caution during Sunday services. Cleanliness is useful, he declared one icy morning, But obsession with the body leads toward vanity of the soul. Several listeners nodded approvingly. The colony now stood caught awkwardly between old fears and new understanding. Elias Turner noticed the tension everywhere. One afternoon, he helped Samuel unload timber near the docks, while several laborers argued nearby beside a frozen wagon. "I'm telling you," one man grumbled, "folk survived centuries without scrubbing themselves daily." Another shrugged. "Folk also died constantly. That's God's will." "No," the second man replied. "Sometimes it's because people drink water with dead pigs floating in it." Even Samuel laughed at that. The story of the contaminated pump had already become part of local legend, repeated so often that details changed slightly each time. Some versions claimed 3 pigs were found inside the well. Others added rats, snakes, or even corpses. Fear always enjoyed exaggeration. Meanwhile, Dr. Pike continued working tirelessly despite lingering exhaustion from the outbreak. His burned hands healed slowly through the winter, leaving thick scars across his palms. More importantly, his reputation had changed. Some colonists respected him more for admitting mistakes. Others trusted him less. A few openly called him unstable after his dramatic behavior during the fire. But Pike no longer seemed interested in protecting his pride. He focused entirely on studying illness. Whenever possible, Elias visited the infirmary to help clean or carry supplies. The physician now insisted on strict routines there. Fresh linens, washed instruments, boiled water, open windows during daylight hours. Certain assistants complained constantly about the extra work. Pike ignored them. One snowy evening, Elias arrived to find the doctor arguing with a visiting physician from another colony, a heavy-set man named Dr. Benjamin Hale. "You are encouraging dangerous habits," Hale snapped while removing gloves near the fireplace. "Excessive washing weakens natural resistance." Pike barely looked up from his notes. "And filth strengthens it. You misunderstand balance." "No," Pike replied coldly. "I misunderstood death." The room fell silent. Dr. Hale noticed Elias standing nearby and lowered his voice. "Your colony suffered tragedy. That can make desperate men chase strange theories." Pike finally stood. "I watched entire families share contaminated cups while wondering why sickness spread room to room. And now you believe soap alone saves lives." "I believe ignorance kills many." Hale scoffed quietly. "Medicine built over centuries should not be discarded because one frightened town found a dead animal in a well." Pike stepped closer. "Then perhaps medicine deserves questioning." The visiting doctor left shortly afterward, looking offended. Elias watched snow drift outside the windows after the door closed. "Do many doctors disagree with you?" he asked. "Most. That doesn't bother you." Pike gave a tired smile. "It terrifies me. That honesty stayed with Elias long afterward, because despite everything, Pike still lacked certainty. He only knew the old beliefs failed too often. During the harsh winter months, another problem slowly emerged across the colony. Bathhouses, or rather the lack of them. Most homes remained too cramped or poor for regular bathing during freezing weather. Heating enough water required enormous labor. Large tubs were expensive. Many families still shared single-room houses where privacy barely existed. Even colonists beginning to accept washing struggled to practice it properly. As a result, odors returned quickly once people spent weeks crowded indoors through winter storms. Wool clothing trapped sweat. Smoke from fireplaces clung to skin and hair. Workers handling animals or fish carried those smells everywhere. The colony smelled less rotten than during summer, but still deeply human. One afternoon, Mary wrinkled her nose dramatically during supper. "Samuel smells like dead boots," she announced. Samuel nearly choked on stew. "I unloaded cod barrels all day." Their mother actually laughed. "That explains it." Mary pointed her spoon at Elias next. "You smell like soap all the time now." Their father grunted. "Better than fish." Small conversations like these would have sounded strange only months earlier. Before the outbreak, nobody discussed personal smell openly unless mocking extreme cases. Now people noticed such things more often. Awareness itself had changed. Late one evening, Elias visited the river alone again, wrapped tightly against the cold. Ice cracked softly near the shoreline, while moonlight reflected across dark water. The old bearded stranger sat near a small fire, roasting fish. "You're still alive," the man muttered. "So are you." "Unfortunately." Elias smiled faintly before sitting beside him. For a while they listened silently to wind moving through frozen reeds. Finally, the old man spoke again. "Town's changing. A little. People still afraid of bathing. Some." The stranger snorted. "Fear never disappears. It just finds new homes." Elias thought about that carefully. Now the colony feared contamination more than water itself. Different fear. Same people. "I saw women scrubbing door handles yesterday," Elias admitted. "Smart. 1 year ago, they would have called that madness." The old man poked the fire thoughtfully. "Human beings cling to ideas like drowning sailors cling to driftwood. Doesn't matter if the wood's rotten." Snow began falling lightly around them. Elias looked toward the river. "When you lived in town, were people always afraid like this?" The stranger laughed quietly. "Boy, colonies survive on fear." "What do you mean?" "Fear of winter, fear of hunger, fear of natives, fear of God, fear of disease." He shrugged. Bathing just became another thing to worry about. That answer felt painfully accurate. By late winter, the colony slowly stabilized. Fewer people died. Trade resumed cautiously. New ships arrived carrying supplies and immigrants, unaware of the terrible summer that had nearly broken the settlement. Life moved forward because it always did. Still, scars remained visible everywhere. One row of abandoned homes near the docks stayed empty after entire families perished. Several children now worked odd jobs after losing parents during the outbreak. Grave markers multiplied beyond the Churchill, and Dr. Pike had become a changed man entirely. He no longer spoke with booming confidence during town gatherings. Instead, he asked questions constantly about symptoms, about water sources, about household habits. Some found this uncertainty unsettling. Others found it strangely trustworthy. One afternoon, Pike gathered several townspeople outside the meeting hall for a public demonstration involving boiled water, soap, and clean cloths. Curious residents watched skeptically while he explained how contamination might travel between people. Reverend Clark observed nearby with folded arms. At one point, an older farmer interrupted angrily. "So now, every sickness comes from dirty hands." "No," Pike answered calmly, "but more sickness may spread that way than we realized." Another man scoffed. "My grandfather never washed more than once monthly, and how many of his children survived adulthood?" Pike asked quietly. The farmer fell silent immediately, because everyone in the colony knew the answer. Very few. That uncomfortable truth haunted colonial life constantly. Death had always seemed ordinary because people expected it, perhaps too much. Later that night, Elias sat beside the workshop fire while his father repaired a cracked bucket handle. "Do you think people will fully stop fearing baths?" Elias asked. His father considered carefully. "Not soon. Even after everything, people don't abandon old beliefs quickly." The older man shaved another, would strip slowly, especially beliefs handed down from parents. Elias nodded. He understood that now. Fear passed through generations, almost like inheritance. A mother warning her child against cold water. A grandfather claiming illness entered through open pores. A preacher connecting cleanliness with vanity. A physician repeating outdated theories because respected men taught them decades earlier. Each person believing they protected the next, until entire societies accepted strange ideas without remembering where they began. Weeks later, as early spring approached, the colony prepared for its first major public gathering since the outbreak. Town leaders organized a market festival hopping to restore morale and attract trade again. Stalls lined the square with smoked meats, fabrics, candles, tools, and imported goods. Musicians played fiddles, while children chased one another through muddy streets. For the first time in many months, laughter sounded louder than funeral bells. Elias wandered through the crowd, beside Samuel, enjoying the rare feeling of normal life returning. Then they stopped suddenly, near one particular merchant stall. Soap, not just rough laundry soap either. scented soap from Europe, fancy wrapped bars with herbs and oils mixed inside. A small crowd surrounded the display curiously. One wealthy woman purchased several immediately. Nearby, an older colonist muttered disapprovingly, "World's gone soft." But another customer replied with a grin, "Maybe soft folks smell better." Even Samuel laughed loudly at that. As evening settled over the festival, lanterns glowed warmly across the square, while snowmelt dripped steadily from rooftops. Elias noticed Dr. Pike, standing alone near the church watching families move through the crowd. The physician looked tired, older, but strangely peaceful. Elias approached him quietly. "You were right about many things," he said. Pike shook his head. "No, I was wrong first." Still changed, the doctor watched children running past with sticky hands and muddy boots. "Most people can change," he murmured. "The difficulty lies in admitting we should." Music drifted softly through the cold evening air. Around them, the colony continued living exactly as humans always had, imperfectly, stubbornly, noisily, and full of contradictions. Some residents would continue fearing baths for decades. Others would embrace new habits immediately, and future generations would eventually look back upon colonial hygiene with disbelief, wondering how intelligent people once feared washing their own bodies. But Elias Turner understood something important now. The people of colonial America were not simply dirty. They were frightened of invisible disease, frightened of sudden death, frightened of changing beliefs that once made the dangerous world feel understandable. And perhaps most frightening of all, they were ordinary people doing their best with incomplete knowledge, just like every generation before them. Spring rain transformed the colony into a world of dripping rooftops, deep mud, and cold gray skis. Water flowed through every street gutter, carrying straw, manure, ash, and broken scraps of winter debris toward the river below. The settlement smelled cleaner than it once had, yet traces of the old odors still lingered beneath damp air and chimney smoke, like ghosts refusing to leave completely. Nearly a year had passed since the terrible outbreak began. The colony survived. Barely, but survival changed people in ways Elias Turner never expected. Public wash basins now stood outside taverns and shops. Several families boiled water regularly without being told. Mothers reminded children to scrub their hands after handling animals. The town council even approved plans for a new deeper, well farther from the waste pits near the market district. Older residents grumbled constantly about such changes. Young folk think soap solves everything. One carpenter complained loudly outside the workshop. Elias' father merely shrugged. "Soap solves smell at least." The carpenter snorted. "Smell builds character." Mary overheard that conversation and laughed so hard she nearly spilled stew across the table later that evening. Even humor around cleanliness had changed. 1 year earlier, nobody joked openly about body odor because everyone smelled roughly the same. Now differences stood out more sharply. Workers washing regularly noticed those who did not. Certain taverns gained reputations for being cleaner than others. A few wealthier homes quietly added private bathing spaces indoors. Slowly, almost invisibly, the colony's customs were shifting. Still, resistance remained stubborn. Reverend Clark continued warning against vanity from the pulpit each Sunday. Though he now washed his hands before meals publicly, he refused to support what he called excessive bodily obsession. Spiritual purity matters more than physical polish. He preached during one crowded service. Afterward, Samuel whispered to Elias outside the church, "Funny how the Reverend's hands stay cleaner than anyone's now." Elias laughed quietly. People rarely changed completely. They simply adapted old beliefs around new realities. Meanwhile, Dr. Pike's reputation remained divided across the colony. Some praised him for helping uncover the contaminated wells and improving practices during the outbreak. Others blamed him for years of misguided advice beforehand. The physician accepted both judgments without argument. He spent most days writing medical notes, observations, records of symptoms and deaths. Sometimes, Elias visited the infirmary simply to help organize papers scattered across Pike's desk. The doctor had become obsessed with documenting everything carefully, terrified future physicians might repeat the same mistakes. One rainy afternoon, Elias found him staring at a half-finished journal beside the window. "What troubles you?" Elias asked. Pike rubbed tired eyes. "I keep wondering how many people died because respected men feared admitting uncertainty." Outside, thunder rolled faintly above the colony. "You couldn't have known everything," Elias replied. "No," Pike agreed quietly, "but I could have questioned more." That sentence lingered painfully between them. Questioned more. Such simple words. Yet entire societies often failed because too few people asked difficult questions. Later that week, another ship arrived from Europe carrying immigrants, tools, fabrics, and news from overseas. Dock workers crowded the harbor, listening eagerly to travelers describe changing cities across the Atlantic. Elias and Samuel helped unload crates, while sailors exchanged rumors nearby. London's improving drainage systems, one merchant claimed. Another laughed. Doesn't stop the smell. A third sailor mentioned public bathhouses, reopening in certain cities, despite older fears. That comment immediately sparked arguments along the docks. Public baths spread disease. No, dirty people spread disease. Too much washing softens the body. That's nonsense. The debate sounded strangely familiar now. Old beliefs refusing to disappear quietly. That evening, Samuel sat beside the river, with Elias watching cargo ships sway gently beneath sunset light. You realize we're probably becoming the strange old men future children laugh about, Samuel said suddenly. Elias smirked. What do you mean? Someday people might think all of us were fools. The idea unsettled him. Perhaps future generations would indeed laugh at colonial fears surrounding bathing and cleanliness. But Elias no longer found the past easy to mock, because he remembered how convincing those fears once felt. The outbreak itself already seemed distant to younger children who barely understood how close the colony came to collapse. New games replaced old anxieties. Market stalls reopened fully. Taverns filled with music again. Human beings recovered quickly from horror. Once survival felt stable again. Too quickly sometimes. One evening, the Turner family hosted supper for Samuel and his mother. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while stew simmered above the fire. During the meal, Samuel's mother surprised everyone by mentioning baths openly. My sister in Philadelphia writes that wealthy families there now bathe weekly. Mary looked fascinated. Every week, their mother still seemed uncertain. In winter, too, so she claims. Elias' father chuckled. That sounds exhausting, but nobody called it dangerous anymore. That alone revealed how much had changed. Later during supper, Mary asked an innocent question. If baths were so terrible, why did people believe in them for so long? Silence settled briefly across the table. Finally, Elias' father answered carefully. Because people trust what parents teach them. Samuel's mother nodded. And because fear spreads faster than proof. Elias immediately remembered the old stranger by the river. The same lesson again. Fear spreads easier than truth. The phrase now felt woven through the colony itself. Days later, Elias returned to the riverbank, hopping to find the bearded old man again. Spring mist floated above the water, while birds called through nearby trees. But the stranger was gone. No fishing gear, no fire pit, nothing except footprints fading into mud near the shore. Perhaps he moved elsewhere. Perhaps he died during winter. Or perhaps he simply preferred disappearing. Once his lessons no longer seemed necessary. Elias never learned the truth. As months passed, the colony continued modernizing slowly. Cleaner wells reduced certain illnesses noticeably. Households washing linens and utensils more carefully experienced fewer fevers. Even skeptical residents grudgingly adopted some new habits once benefits became difficult to ignore. Still, contradictions survived. People washed hands more often while continuing to dump waste near roads. Some feared contaminated water, yet ignored spoiled food left in heat. Others scrubbed obsessively, but refused proper ventilation because drafts still frightened them. Progress rarely moved cleanly. It stumbled forward unevenly through confusion and resistance. One hot afternoon during early summer, Nearly 1 year after Elias first stepped secretly into the river, the town council held a public meeting regarding construction of communal bath facilities near the new well. The proposal shocked half the colony. Arguments erupted immediately. Bathhouses encourage indecency. They spread sickness. No, filth spreads sickness. We survived generations without them, and buried generations too. The meeting lasted hours beneath suffocating heat, while flies buzzed around sweating townspeople packed into the hall. Elias watched Dr. Pike quietly during the debate. The physician no longer spoke with fiery certainty. Instead, he simply listened. Finally, one councilman asked directly whether Pike supported public bathing. The doctor stood slowly. "I support cleanliness." Murmurs rolled across the room. Pike continued carefully. "But I also support caution. Shared water must remain fresh. Facilities must stay maintained." One older farmer scoffed. "So baths are safe now?" Pike looked at him steadily. "No practice is perfectly safe." The room quieted slightly. "But ignorance," Pike added softly, "is often far more dangerous." That sentence ended most arguments better than shouting ever could. The council eventually approved a small trial bathhouse, despite heavy opposition. Construction began weeks later. Some residents mocked it endlessly. Others lined up curiously before completion even finished. The colony stood halfway between two worlds now, one shaped by inherited fear, the other by painful experience, and somewhere between them, ordinary people tried figuring out how to live. Late one evening, Elias sat outside the workshop, beside his father watching workers haul timber toward the future bathhouse site. "You think people will truly use it?" Elias asked. His father scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Some will, and the others, they'll complain while secretly wanting to try it." Elias laughed. That sounded exactly right. The older man looked toward the darkening sky. "When I was young, folks feared tomatoes because they thought the fruit was poisonous." "They are." "No," his father smiled faintly. But enough people believed it that the fear felt real. The colony itself now felt like that, full of old invisible fears, slowly dissolving beneath experience. Yet Elias understood something important after everything that happened. Human beings rarely believed foolish things because they were stupid. Usually they believed them because those ideas once offered comfort, protection, or explanation in a dangerous, uncertain world. Colonial Americans feared bathing partly because disease truly surrounded them constantly. Water often was contaminated. Shared tubs sometimes spread infection. Sudden cold exposure could worsen illness for weakened bodies. A few truths slowly twisted across generations into larger misunderstandings. And once entire communities accepted those misunderstandings, questioning them became frightening, because changing beliefs meant admitting previous generations, parents, doctors, ministers, respected elders, might have been wrong. That realization unsettled people more deeply than dirt ever could. As sunset faded over the colony, lanterns glowed warmly beside muddy streets, while distant laughter drifted from taverns once more. The settlement remained imperfect, still crowded, still noisy, still smelling occasionally of manure and smoke, but cleaner than before, and perhaps a little wiser. The wisdom Elias now understood often arrived painfully late. Tomorrow, the first public bathhouse would officially open. Half the colony planned to avoid it completely. The other half planned to inspect it out of nervous curiosity. And before another year passed, an event inside those wooden walls would force Elias Turner and the entire settlement to confront one final terrifying question about cleanliness, fear, and the strange, fragile line separating progress from disaster. The morning the colony's first public bathhouse opened, rain clouds hung low above the rooftops, while nervous excitement spread through the streets faster than church gossip. People gathered near the new wooden structure beside the deep well long before sunrise, pretending they merely wanted to observe construction details or inspect the council's spending. In truth, almost everyone came for the same reason: curiosity. The bathhouse itself looked modest compared to wealthy private bathing rooms Elias had seen before. A squat timber building with narrow windows, steaming chimneys, and separate washing areas divided by thick wooden walls. Workers hauled heated water inside using barrels throughout the morning, while townspeople lingered nearby whispering theories. It'll spread fever within weeks. No, it'll improve health. Too much hot water weakens the blood. At least folk might smell better. Samuel stood beside Elias near the entrance, watching the crowd grow larger. This feels less like a bathhouse opening and more like an execution, he muttered. Elias laughed quietly. In many ways, the colony viewed the place almost as a dangerous experiment. Reverend Clark arrived shortly before noon, wearing his stern black coat despite the rising humidity. Though he publicly opposed excessive indulgence, curiosity clearly dragged him there as well. Dr. Pike appeared soon afterward carrying notebooks beneath one arm. The physician looked older than he had a year earlier, but calmer somehow. Less certain, more observant. Town leaders gave awkward speeches about cleanliness, modern improvements, and public welfare, while half the audience listened skeptically. Finally, the doors opened. Nobody moved. The silence became almost painful. Then, unexpectedly, an elderly widow named Martha Bell stepped forward, leaning heavily on her cane. "Well," she announced loudly, "I've smelled all of you for 20 years already. Might as well try surviving cleaner." Laughter broke the tension instantly, and just like that, people slowly began entering. Some emerged later, looking embarrassed. Others looked delighted by the warmth and comfort. A few claimed immediately that the steam made them dizzy and dangerous. Arguments restarted before sunset, but the bathhouse remained standing, and more importantly, people returned the next day, then the next. Not everyone, of course. Certain colonists still refused completely. Some considered public washing sinful or unhealthy. Others distrusted shared water, no matter how carefully maintained. Yet change had undeniably begun. Weeks passed. Summer returned gradually, though less brutally than the terrible season before. The colony felt busier now. Cleaner wells reduced stomach illnesses noticeably. Regular washing became more common among younger families. Soap merchants expanded business rapidly. Life moved forward. Then came the accident. It happened during one unbearably humid afternoon, when the bathhouse stood crowded with laborers returning from dock work. Elias himself had been repairing water barrels nearby when shouting erupted from inside the building. At first, he assumed another argument had started. Then smoke appeared. People burst through the doors, coughing violently. Fire, someone screamed. Panic exploded instantly. Workers inside overturned heating lamps while rushing toward exits. Steam and smoke filled the narrow rooms together, creating terrifying confusion. Several men collided, trying to escape slippery floors. Elias and Samuel sprinted toward the entrance alongside half the street. Through the smoke, Elias heard terrified voices yelling from inside. Someone remained trapped. Without thinking, he covered his mouth and pushed into the building. Heat slammed into him immediately. Steam clouded everything. Shadows stumbled through the haze, while burning wood crackled overhead. A fallen lantern had ignited part of the wall beside the heating stove. "Help!" The voice came from deeper inside. Elias forced himself forward, slipping across wet floors, until he found a young dockworker pinned beneath a collapsed bench. Smoke thickened rapidly around them. Together, Elias and another man lifted the heavy wood enough for the trapped worker to crawl free. All three staggered toward daylight moments before part of the ceiling collapsed behind them in a burst of sparks. Outside, townspeople formed bucket lines from the well, while Dr. Pike treated burns and smoke inhalation victims nearby. The bathhouse survived, barely, but as frightened residents gathered watching smoke drift into the summer sky, Elias realized something strange. Nobody blamed bathing. Months earlier, the entire colony would have declared the fire proof that public washing angered God or weakened society. Now people blamed faulty lantern placement, unsafe construction, poor ventilation, practical problems, not invisible moral dangers. That difference mattered as workers repaired the damaged bathhouse over following weeks. Elias noticed how much the colony's thinking had shifted within only a year. Fear still existed, always would, but fear no longer controlled every explanation. One evening near sunset, Elias sat beside the river, with Dr. Pike watching golden light ripple across the water. The physician looked exhausted after supervising repairs and treating injured workers all week. "Funny thing about people," Pike murmured quietly. "What?" Elias asked. "They can survive terrible truths easier than uncertainty." Elias thought about that carefully. When the outbreak began, everyone wanted simple answers. Pike continued. Bad air, cold water, divine punishment. Anything clear enough to feel safe. But the truth was complicated. Yes, Pike smiled faintly. And humans hate complicated truths. The river moved gently beneath fatting sunlight. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Elias asked the question lingering in his mind since childhood. "Do you think people will ever stop believing foolish things?" Pike actually laughed. "No." The answer came instantly. "But perhaps," the doctor added, "they can learn to question them sooner." Across the colony, evening smoke rose peacefully from chimneys, while distant music drifted from taverns reopening after the bathhouse fire. Children ran through muddy streets laughing. Merchants argued over prices. Workers hauled cargo beneath the fatting heat. Ordinary life, messy and imperfect. Elias realized then that history itself worked much like the colony. People carried ideas forward generation after generation. Some ideas protected them wisely, others quietly harmed them. Yet separating truth from fear often required suffering first. Colonial Americans had not avoided bathing because they were filthy animals or foolish caricatures. They were frightened people living in a dangerous world without modern knowledge. Disease struck suddenly and invisibly. Children died young. Wells became poisoned. Shared water truly could spread sickness under terrible conditions. Fear grew naturally from such uncertainty, and over time, that fear hardened into tradition. Tradition became certainty. Certainty became culture, until entire communities forgot why the fear existed in the first place. Months later, during early autumn, Elias walked once more beside the river at dawn. Mist drifted above the water exactly as it had the first morning. He secretly splashed cold river water across his face. So much had changed since then. The colony smelled cleaner now, though never completely clean. Public wells received inspections regularly. Families washed more often. Children learned habits their parents once considered unnecessary, and yet human nature remained wonderfully familiar. People still argued constantly, still feared rumors, still clung stubbornly to comforting beliefs, still searched desperately for certainty whenever danger appeared. Elias knelt beside the river and touched the water quietly. Cold, refreshing, ordinary. He smiled, softly remembering how terrifying this simple act once seemed. Behind him, the colony slowly awakened beneath pale sunrise light. Church bells echoed faintly. Roosters called from muddy yards. Smoke drifted upward from morning fires. Life continued, as it always would, and somewhere far in the future, generations, yet unborn, would look back at colonial America with disbelief, wondering how anyone could fear bathing so deeply. But they would forget something important. Every era carries its own invisible fears. Every society believes certain strange things with complete confidence. And someday, people in the future may laugh at modern beliefs just as easily. That was the final lesson Elias Turner carried from the strange, dirty world of colonial America. Not that people were foolish for fearing baths, but that human beings, no matter the century, often mistake familiarity for truth until experience finally forces them to wash old ideas away.